Great. Okay, so we have a lot to cover today, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Tara, and I'm the Groundwater Solutions Consultant at MLJ Environmental. And I'm joined online by my colleagues Robert, our Vice President, and Roop, our Chief Technical Officer. And together we are conducting a five-part series called the Sigma Data Series, which will hopefully help you tackle groundwater data challenges and ensure that your data stays useful and reliable. We've learned a lot about data management under Sigma over the years, so we thought it would be a good idea to share perspectives with other experts. And this is the first session of that series, so thanks for joining us. We will be touching on what data do we actually need. So let's get into it. Okay, so today is all about understanding the foundations of data management under Sigma. I know a lot of people already know about that, but it's the first session, so we're going to do a bit of a backstory and how better data and better data management can help with compliance and can help keep groundwater management locally controlled. We are also going to talk about how to go about deciding which data, sorry, say that again?
You're okay. It was a verbal someone joining. That's it.
Okay, got it. Yeah, so yes, we're going to be talking about how to go about deciding which data to prioritize. And then finally, we will be taking a look at examples of data points you might want to collect based on different management actions. And before we do that, for those who are unfamiliar, I'm going to give a brief intro to MLJ and what we do and why we work on data management so much. So we are an environmental consulting and technology firm. And for the past 25 years, we have been supporting growers across California to navigate water regulations. A big chunk of that work is our compliance work that we do for water quality coalitions in the Central Valley under the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. So we build custom member portals and we handle the water quality monitoring and data management for the coalitions across the Central Valley. And then on the Sigma side, which is what you're seeing in the map over here, we support Sigma compliance and GSP implementation for GSAs in the Kings and Tulare Lake subbasins with our water accounting and well registration tool watermark. So that's kind of a bit of a background on what we do. I wanted to get started before we go into data management under Sigma. I'm hoping we can do a bit of a poll here or a question. What comes to mind when you think of data management under Sigma? So you can use the QR code over here to scan that in, or you can join at menti.com and use the code on the screen. So I'm going to give just a minute to get everybody's answers here. Okay. So I see we have data tracking, budgeting, allocations, spreadsheets, dashboards, databases, engineering. Yep. Yeah, great. It is complex. It's expensive. We're thinking about security. We're thinking about reliability and efficiency. Okay. Absolutely. Okay, great. So it looks like everybody kind of is on the same page here. We're trying to figure out how to go about, making our data management useful under Sigma. There's a lot of considerations. It's very complex. So I think it's a good idea to just start off by doing a bit of going back to basics for a second, just to try to situate why we're doing a whole series on data management under Sigma. So what is the goal here? What are we trying to achieve? What do we need to do under Sigma to remain in compliance? And how does data help us achieve those goals and stay in compliance? So SGMA obviously has a primary goal of achieving groundwater sustainability by 2040. So there's several different indicators for what that means to be sustainable, a lot of different pathways to get there. But basically, we're all trying to ensure the resilience of our groundwater resources. Data is important here because the more information we have, the better we can manage our resources and move forwards towards that goal. So data helps us know what decisions to make to move our basin towards sustainability. And equally important of a goal here for GSAs and subbasins is to maintain local control of your groundwater resources. So we're trying to continue to manage groundwater at the local level, stay in compliance, and avoid state intervention. And as long as local efforts to manage groundwater are working, and GSA managers are taking the steps to do that, we can hold off state intervention. And so data comes in over here because it helps us build our local groundwater story. So the more information we have, the better we can manage things locally. It gives us credible information to understand our local groundwater story, our local groundwater conditions over here, and then make informed decisions to continue to move towards sustainability. So data management really is the connector over here between staying in compliance with SGMA and actually helping keep that groundwater management local. I'll touch a little bit more on the local control element in a couple of slides. So where are we at in the process? So 10 years into the program, it's 2025. Many GSPs have been submitted. Most folks are beginning to or have started moving into the implementation side of things. And we have really 15 years or so to get things on track. So whatever stage you are at in terms of GSP approval and determination, you're starting to think about implementation. And your status affects your data collection requirements. So the state has now said that even basins with approved GSPs may be subject to state action if undesirable results continue. And so folks are really starting to think about what does that mean in terms of my data collection requirements? And there are actually different requirements for compliance depending on your GSP status. So data management can actually affect that status. So I want to touch on probationary basins and probationary GSAs for a second. So for basins under probation, there are certain data points that become mandatory for GSAs to collect according to the state. So if a GSA is under probation, they are then required to do well registration and extraction reporting. So their growers are required to register their wells with a fee of $300 per well and an extraction fee of $20 per acre foot. With certain exceptions. When the state puts you under probation, it also has the authority to grant exemptions to the GSAs for certain reasons. So if a GSA proves that it's a good faith actor, or in other words, if it shows enough of an effort to stay in compliance, these GSAs are able to gain exemptions from their reporting, fee, and certain requirements. So the exemptions are based on initiatives that the GSA has taken. And I'm going to go into, there have been a couple of cases so far of exemptions. There's only 2 basins under probation right now. But I'm going to give one example of the Kern Tulare Water District GSA, which falls in the Tule and Kern subbasins. So this GSA was exempt by the state when Tule was put under probation. And then a few months later at the Kern probationary hearing in February, the GSA was again recommended for exemption, with some of the reasoning listed for the exemption being that the GSA already had its own well registration and extraction reporting requirements. So obviously that's not the only reason, but it definitely enabled exemption that the GSA was doing those data collection and management action requirements already from beforehand. So in both of the cases, the reason for exemption for Kern Tulare Water District GSA included management actions like well registration and extraction reporting, which are the same required actions for the GSAs under probation. So the difference is essentially fees and then having that data stay local. So the GSAs that are under probation are now required to do that well registration extraction reporting, but then that data goes to the state. However, the GSAs that are under probation are doing those management actions in order to gain exemption, but they don't have to pay those same fees and they're able to keep that control local. So what I'm trying to say here is you will have to do the data management anyway. The difference here is fees and local control versus fees versus local control. So that's kind of the difference between voluntary data management versus mandatory data reporting that goes to the state. So in one case, it stays local. In another case, it goes to the state. Obviously, there's That's not the only reason why somebody would be under probation, but it definitely was an enabling factor for this one GSA to achieve exemption. I was planning on keeping questions till the end, if that's okay. But if there's a quick one, I can take it.
You want me to? Yeah. Is your assumption that the GSAs would be collecting the data for the state? Or because my understanding is it gets reported by the individuals.
Yes. So it's reported by the growers. Yes. But what I mean is that the GSAs are subject to those data reporting requirements for their growers, right? But in the other case, the GSAs will anyways require their growers to do that data collection, but that data then stays local rather than going to the state.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we've established why data management is important under SGMA and how it can help not only help you remain in compliance and achieve sustainability, but also how it supports local groundwater management. So now let's get into how to actually figure out what data to collect. So the general goal with data collection is for that data to be useful to us, right? So without purpose and structure, data can become messy and cluttered and kind of just be there without having any purpose to us. So the goal is for the data to create a clear picture for us of what's going on in our management area, in our GSA, in our subbasin, pull together those trends and identify gaps, and then have that information facilitate decision making for us to stay in compliance. So we are starting at the bottom here with raw data collection, and in order to get to decision making, we have to build a solid foundation of data collection. And what that means is that GSAs need to be strategic with what kind of data to collect. So ultimately, that starts with the fact that the data that you collect needs to be informed by policy. So the further along you are in your data management journey, your data will also come back to you and help you inform your next steps with your policy. So policy will help you figure out what data to collect, and data then in turn helps you figure out what policies to implement going forward. So by policy, what I mean initially is your GSP. Your GSP is your roadmap. It outlines your required actions and metrics and thresholds that will help you stay in compliance. And GSAs will draw from their GSP to decide what policies to implement. And the data that you collect will be informed by those policies. So data needs are going to vary based on your chosen project and management actions and management strategies. So that will help you figure out what kind of data to collect. Are you trying to do reporting? Are you trying to collect data to figure out an allocation? Are you collecting data to figure out how to divvy up GSA fees? And with that, it's important to then think ahead with your compliance, meaning not only do you need to be thinking about what your current policies are and what data those require of you, but your GSP roadmap overall. So for example, if you have a metering policy for your GSA that requires your constituents to install meters on their wells, is that ultimately leading towards an extraction reporting policy? And what kinds of data do you need for both? So the policies that you implement now, as well as the policies that you might implement in the future, will influence what data you need to collect. So start with your GSP to keep that long-term vision and to figure out what you really need to be tracking. And then on the other side, the data that you choose to track will end up informing your roadmap to sustainability. So the data that you're collecting will help you identify gaps and trends to figure out how to get there. So how are you reducing demand? How are you increasing supply? What are the numbers showing for that? Hopefully those numbers will give you information that you need to continue to make decisions locally about your groundwater management. So the data will help you figure out what is the data showing you about the gaps that still remain? What does it show you about what you need to do to stay in compliance and where action is needed? So for example, let's say, and this is the case for a lot of GSAs and basins, let's say you don't know whether or not you need an allocation to balance your basin. You're hoping that you don't, obviously, and you're hoping that projects will get you there and that conditions will remain favorable. So you decide to gather water usage data for your growers for a few years, and then use these trends to project what your overdraft is. and project that your overdraft might only be mitigated with reduced pumping. So the data would help you figure out what policies to implement to stay in compliance going forward. So the crux here, the real first step here, is to look at your GSP and to figure out, and your projects and management actions, and to figure out at a high level what you need for GSP implementation, what projects and management actions are laid out in the GSP in order to achieve sustainability. Okay, so if your GSP is your roadmap for how to get to sustainability, your projects and management actions are the commitments that you have made that detail your options for how to mitigate overdraft, how to balance your subbasin. They'll include a variety of initiatives to both increase supply and reduce demand in your GSA. And there's two main avenues here in how to balance a basin, right? Ultimately, either you will have to increase the supply of groundwater, or you'll have to reduce the demand and reduce the amount of pumping that's happening. Likely, it will be a combination of both, right? You're going to need to get that surface water in the ground, and you'll likely need to reduce the amount of pumping that's happening. And in all cases, you must be able to measure groundwater and track the ins and outs of that water. What is coming in, what is going out, where is the water coming in, where is it coming out from? The data will help you implement Sigma, and it'll also help you prove that you're doing it. So everybody's taking steps, implementing projects, implementing management actions. And if you are measuring that water, where it's going, where it's coming from, and how much of it, you'll be able to provide that necessary proof to show that, hey, we're doing this, we're actually trying to balance our basin, and the numbers are trending towards that. So management actions that I'm listing here are kind of more specific action items that you will do to balance your overdraft, close those data gaps, and gather that information to stay in compliance. So ultimately, your data collection is driven by what management actions you are implementing. What information will be helpful to you? What information is essential to collect based on your chosen management strategies? What are we doing here that is moving us towards sustainability, and how do we measure those actions to show that we are actually moving in that direction? So wanted to ask what everybody thinks about, and it's the same QR code as last time. So if you have that page still open, just use that. What projects or management actions do you currently need data for? What policies are you implementing that you need to start collecting data for? I'll give it a minute. Okay, balance, fines, credits, tracking usage, that's a big one. HCM, groundwater levels. Allocations and recharge. Okay. Yes, so there are a variety of management actions here that we need to collect data for. So now that we know that our data choices have to come from our policies and management strategies, let's get into a bit of what data we should be collecting. Okay, so there was a lot of different ones that came on the Mentimeter. We are going to touch specifically on these three: well registration, and with that comes parcel claiming, water accounting and usage tracking, and then allocations, trading, and fees. Okay, so if you have a well registration in place and you're looking to identify where the wells are, how many, and what they're used for, the type of information that you will need to collect, it's important to think about the pipeline and the long-term vision. So with well registration, often well registration is a step that GSAs might take to gain a better understanding of the groundwater situation in their management area, where are the wells, information about the wells. And once you know where they are, you have a better path forward for future management actions. So, for example, if you have a well mitigation program, it becomes important to know the well type and the status. So which wells are domestic, which ones are agricultural, which wells are active and inactive, so that if your grower, if there's a trigger that a well has run dry, you know where that well is, you have that information about that well, you know that it's domestic, you know that it was active and now it's inactive. If you are charging fees or requiring extraction reporting for your pumpers, and if you're stratifying that based on de minimis users versus agricultural or over 2 acre feet users, it's also important to know what type of well that is, what it's being used for, right? And it's important to tie those wells to their legal landowners. So that comes from the county parcel data. To do that, there's going to be a GIS element to tie that well to a geographical location, and it will help you identify data gaps, right? In this map, you can see where the wells are. That's kind of shown by the dots, and the gray areas are showing where there isn't any data. And so that will help the GSA manager to then go in and say, okay, I need to contact this landowner and make sure that they are reporting whether they have a well or not on property. And then if you have an allocation program later down the line, sometimes those allocation programs are based on well depth. So you'll be choosing what the allocation factor is for each user based on well depth. In that case, the well depth data point becomes important. So ultimately with well registration, there's a number of different data types you may try to collect. It's important to think down the pipeline of what other management actions you will be taking, what well registration will facilitate for you later down the line in terms of policy, and figure out what data points to collect based on that. Okay, moving into water accounting and usage tracking. Usage tracking is not necessarily a management action in itself, but more so it is data that becomes important for a variety of different management actions. So as I mentioned, almost any strategy to achieve sustainability and to remain in balance will require you to know the ins and outs of water. So it's important to think about what asset you want to tie this water usage to. If that becomes something that you're going to allocate later down the line, if it's something you're going to be allowed, something you are going to be allowing trading for, will you tie it to individual wells? So will that water usage be, okay, I'm just going to look at the pumping on each well. Are you tying it to parcels? So is that consumptive use? Are you going to be looking at the usage beyond just the parcel, and you want landowners to be able to group parcels into water accounts to group their water usage? So just important to think about what that asset is, what that water asset is, what are you tying it to, and where is that data coming from? And are you trying to be able to calculate water usage out by crop, or are you keeping it just at the parcel level? And ultimately, one of the main things with water usage here, and I'm sure everybody knows that already, is figuring out what data source to use to effectively track your usage. I know there's a lot of opinions about different data sources, and people have ones that they like and ones that they dislike. Overall, there are pros and cons to weigh up with each different data source. So one way to do usage tracking is through meters and metering wells. The pros here is that, that's a granular level. You're tying that water usage to each well and what each well is pumping. So there's that granularity there. A lot of folks think that meters are accurate. Especially if you're having, efficiency tests every once in a while. But the big barrier to adoption over there is that there's a very high upfront cost for meters, and you require buy-in of all your growers, right? If you're trying to meter all of your growers, then you need buy-in from each grower to actually install a meter on their well. Another option that a lot of GSAs are exploring here is ET and remote sensing. The pro here is that there's no need for grower action. You can select an ET service provider who will be able to kind of get you that information for all the parcels in your management area. But one concern that I've heard over here is that There's less nuance to the ET. So, if somebody's using slightly more, slightly less than their projected evapotranspiration, there's no opportunity to kind of cross-reference those numbers there. And it captures consumptive usage. So beyond just groundwater pumping, it captures the overall usage that crop needs to achieve high yield. And then the final one over here is self-reporting from growers. So that involves growers putting their pumping inputs into a database and reporting those numbers on a regular basis. The pros here is that it's a lower cost option, and it's a familiar process because growers are, for better or worse, used to reporting certain data points from the ILRP side of things. That's kind of where we have experienced it in the past, but again, you need buy-in from growers, and there are concerns from GSAs that grower reporting might lead to inaccuracy, right? You don't know if your growers are reporting the correct numbers, and there could be inconsistent participation as well. Ultimately, it's important to choose one and move forward with it. Choose one or more. You can always cross-reference that with another one later. As I said, usage tracking prefaces a number of other management actions. So the earlier you start that process, the more data you will have to help you identify trends and make decisions. It's very personal according to each GSA for which data source they are going to end up choosing. But one is better than none, right? To be able to move forward and make those decisions and move forward with the rest of the policies. All right, and then finally, I know allocations was mentioned in the Mentimeter. A lot of GSAs are starting to think about that, and especially high priority and critically overdrafted basins will likely have to implement some sort of demand reduction strategy, whether that's allocations or something else, in order to achieve sustainability. And a lot of GSAs are coming to that realization. And so the first thing for GSAs to do is to figure out what type of allocation you're looking to do. I attended a management actions workshop by Sturgba GSA recently, and they did a really good job of laying out what a potential allocation program will look like in terms of rules. So allocations it's entirely dependent on having information about wells, about water usage, and then making decisions about how much people can use, and then moving forward from there. So that is the first step, is to figure out the rules and to get that data from beforehand of the wells and the water usage, to then move forward. So you need to decide, are you going to be allocating based on pumping based on wells, or are you going to be allocating based on overall consumptive use? Does your water usage data source already have that number that you're working with in terms of pumping, or do you need to calculate it out, how much of that usage is coming from groundwater versus surface water and precipitation? Will you be allocating an overall flat base allocation based on acreage? Is it by crop type? Is it by well depth? And in that case, if it's by well depth, for example, you might need to start doing a well registration program to get that information about well depth. If it's by crop type, you might need to implement an ET provider who has that crop type and has that average pumping based on each crop. So how are credits going to work in your allocation scheme? Is there a ramp down, and what are the numbers for that ramp down? So allocations, I will say, comes down to a lot of calculations and setting rules from beforehand that you can work with to figure out what those allocations are going to be. So the same way that well registration programs, as I mentioned, well registration requires you to have foresight, right? Well registration might be an initial step that you're taking, and it will require you to have foresight of what info you're going to need in the future. Allocation programs instead require you to work a little bit backwards and to figure out what data to collect before implementing that allocation program to make that program work, right? Another consideration here is that data needed for allocation programs are also needed by growers and GSAs, right? If you're going to do an allocation, your growers need to have that usage data to be able to make decisions about their farming practices, and to make decisions about, if I need to change my crop or fallow a field. I'll need that historical usage data to be able to project my water budget going forward, see where my allocation falls in the past and where I run out of water, and figure out how to get that water into my farm or to change my farming practices. So it's also important to think about who that data is for. If you're going to be assessing fees with that, you also need to figure out what those fees are going to be based on. So is the fee going to be a flat fee based on area, in which case you will need the parcel data from the county. If it's by well, you will need to be able to figure out the location and the number of wells and well count, and perhaps do a well registration program for that. And then if it's by water usage, so if you're stratifying fees based on how much everybody's pumping, then you need to start collecting that data beforehand as well to give folks the agency and the autonomy to be able to make decisions about that. And then looking a little bit ahead, if you are planning on allowing your growers to trade credits eventually, your water becomes a limited asset, right? So as a grower, you will need to be able to tie that asset to a water account and group your parcels together strategically. So as a GSA, you're going to need to be able to see what each parcel or water usage is to ensure that everybody's staying within the allocation, as well as kind of seeing what assets that water is being tied to. So I know that was a lot over there, but allocations, trading, and fees are all things that require data from beforehand that you're collecting to be able to project trends and for growers to be able to see themselves what's going on in their individual parcels, in their farms, to be able to make decisions about how to move forward from there. Okay, so one last thing over here, just wanted to check what data points do you need to start collecting now? So we've kind of gone over how policy informs what data you collect. And ultimately, it is the management actions and your management strategies and your policies that are going to be determining what data to collect. So just wanted to ask over here, what data points do you need to start collecting? Water, yes, very vague. I'm assuming that you mean water usage tracking. Yep. Location of wells, location of water, amount of water that's coming in and out. There's a time factor over here. So when folks are, when in the year there's higher water usage and when there's lower water usage. Meters. Yep. Folks are thinking of implementing meters over in their basins. All right. Don't know how that happened. Okay. Okay, so I wanted to kind of keep the presentation a bit short to give some time for discussion and questions. I know we covered a lot. Yeah, essentially, that this first session was kind of trying to give a bit of an overview of Sigma data management, why data management is important under Sigma, how to go about deciding what data points to collect based on your policies, and then a bit of information on, what data points you actually should be collecting based on different management strategies. So wanted to open it up for discussion over here. Do we have any questions or comments? Okay. I'll give it another 30 seconds in case anybody's like thinking of trying to formulate a question.
The other piece we can throw out there too is if there's no questions pertaining to this, just questions in general, or this series is something we kind of came up on our own in a silo. If there was something that people think would be helpful to see in a different presentation, we would like to hear that too. Maybe it's something we can shift or pivot to add into the next one. Always open to that. And I do see a hand raised from Reed.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
What is kind of the right time to begin this? Do we begin it at the fiscal year? Do we begin it at the beginning of the irrigation season? Do we start now because you've made us all worried? Like what instantly right now, just go outside and start measuring water? Kind of, I know the next series is how to collect the right data, but how does this rollout begin?
I don't think that there's any wrong time. There's a lot of conversation that goes into this too. So even just kind of having these things bubble up to the surface to talk about is probably a good starting point. If you wanted to engage in, we have done implementations or work through this process with other clients. We're always open to just offering up some of the roadmaps we've already done and be like, does this fit into what you're looking for? Do you have any data to start with? I don't think there's any too early to even just start talking about what does those first couple steps look like.
Right. Just to ease your mind a little bit, the intention was less to make you worried. Obviously, there is a lot to think about, but it's more just to say that there is a roadmap already there for you, right? Your GSP outlines your strategy to get to sustainability and to stay in compliance, right? And so if you're able to start with your projects and management actions and your policies, kind of see a little bit down the pipeline of where are we going with this, and then that'll help you figure out what data to start collecting, right? It's always better to be a little preemptive with it if possible. Yeah.
And then a follow-up to that, at least in our basin, we have several counties that already do data, but it's not all complete. It's not complied. So we've got a little bit here and a little bit there. And is that, something that we start with and start coalescing and start piecing together kind of that map, of where the data is just taking an inventory of what we already have kind of available to us, that people have already done the work.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. To maybe put your mind at ease too. There's organizations out there that don't even have anything to really start with. They're starting fresh. So if you already have some pieces that can be brought together, or even kind of just sat down and looked at, like, okay, we have a spreadsheet over here, we have some paper project over here. There's a database that existed, maybe a couple of years ago, and bringing that all together into one place so that you can make some decisions from it. That's a great place to be. So you have a question from Joff too.
Yeah, I guess a response to the first question, there's no right time to start, but we had it on our agenda at the GSA for several months, and we sent out mailers to all the landowners so that when we did it, it wasn't a surprise. And we started with, it was a water year, which doesn't match a calendar year. I think it starts in October. And in terms of getting all the data, you just have to harass some people and send out mailers multiple times is what we ended up doing. And finally, the penalty letters for not registering is what inspired the holdouts. But as much notice as possible, and then having a telephone line so that they can call and yell at you when you start harassing them more is a good idea. But it's painful to get it started, and then once it is, I think people are trying to comply.
Yeah, so any more questions or anything else that you would like to see covered in a later session?
I think I'm curious about how these rollouts go over time, because we are looking at sustainability timeline into 2040. So what's the, I know you're talking about data and roadmaps, but I think I'd be curious to see, like, okay, 5 years of data is kind of enough to begin starting to understand this policy here, because enough things have happened. So now we can that's enough of a background to kind of start making policy around.
I think one thing is Joff made a really good point. You actually have some people in this room that have had success, such as Joff in the El Rico GSA. He might even be a better person to answer that question of what do you need to get started? I don't know if there's like a pinpoint you can say you need X amount of data.
I think
Is it Reed? Is that who's asking the question?
Yes.
That's what it says on the screen.
Yeah.
It probably depends on what sub-basin you're in. In Tulare Lake, we were severely overdrafted, and there was no doubt that we needed to slow down pumping. So we set some rules. That might be different if you're in an area that isn't overdrafted, because you don't have, what we did was a step down each 5 years for how much water could be pumped to get to the sustainable number at the end. And if you're in an area that doesn't have that issue, it would be a different implementation, I think, and maybe collecting the data and then setting it up before you start penalizing people would be an acceptable way. But it really depends on what sub-basin you're in, I think.
right. I think to add to what Joff said, I think it is an iterative process, right? So it's not like, yes, in certain places, time is of the essence, you need to start ASAP. But I do also think that, what you were saying about maybe like spending 5 years gathering data before taking any action, I don't think that's necessarily the only way to do it. I think that there are ways to do it where you're collecting data and you're starting right now, and then in 6 months, you're taking action on a policy, and then kind of adjusting along the way based on that data. So that's kind of the feedback loop that we were talking about earlier, about policy informs the data you collect, yes. But once you start collecting data, the data will inform your policy as well, right? It'll inform the micro adjustments that you need to make, and what to do next. So
Kind of depends on where you want to start. I mean, I'm using very broad strokes, but well registration, getting information about those assets, where those are located, is usually, a good starting place that can help you roll into pumping and estimated usage and ET. Kind of going down that water banking, water allocation roadmap kind of depends on where you're headed. Like Josh said, though, there is a lot of messaging ahead of time that does make some of this process easier, getting the word out of, if you can decide on, you want this one thing, you want to know where all your wells are. Okay, that's a good place you can start. And that can be your beginning step. Okay, we're going to talk to our constituents and get the word out that this is what we're collecting and here's why. And here's a relationship with whoever we're doing it with, or why you're getting these things in the mail. The more people, I think, feel informed and a part of the process, it seems to, I don't think it's going to be great. No one ever, I don't think really, like, at the end of the day, really wants to do this. It comes down to you kind of have to, and what's the best way to go about it to make it as painless as possible.
Thanks, everybody.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So this question is for Tulare County, I think. Do you guys meter all wells, or just like you do exclude de minimis wells, like privately owned, little household wells, or are you tracking everything or just your big agricultural users, your production users?
We didn't require houses to put on a meter, but anything above 2 acre feet is required.
All right. Are there any last questions? Okay. If there are any questions that come up later, feel free to note down my email. I'm pretty responsive and happy to just call as well and have a chat. Other than that, thank you so much. I really appreciate that there's so many experts in the room here with us as well. It's always really helpful to get different perspectives. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one. I'll stay on the line for a couple minutes just in case. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh.